The ground shook with a steady, rhythmic pounding, a drumbeat of destruction that rolled across the French countryside without pause. The shells came whistling in from miles away, arcing high over the trenches before plunging down onto German positions, with terrifying accuracy. The men in those positions could do nothing but press themselves into the earth and pray. What made this barrage different from any other in the long history of warfare was simple and invisible. A pair of eyes in the sky, looking down through a celluloid disc marked with concentric circles and clock numerals, talking to the gunners through a wireless transmitter. The airplane overhead was not dropping bombs. It was not firing a weapon. It was simply watching. And that watching made the artillery below more lethal than any general had ever imagined possible. When the shells found their mark, the effect was instantaneous and absolute. A German ammunition column caught in the open simply vanished, replaced by a crater and a scattering of broken wreckage. The observer in the aircraft above penciled a quick notation on his map, then keyed his wireless set to signal the next correction. Right 50, short 100. Fire for effect. He had been aloft for 2 hours already, circling in a slow, stable machine that offered no protection from the cold wind or from the enemy fighters that occasionally rose to challenge him. But the information he sent back was worth more than a squadron of heavy guns firing blind. The age of precision artillery had arrived, and at its heart was the reconnaissance flyer. That observer's work, the deadly accuracy of those shells, had its roots in an event that had occurred not quite a decade and a half earlier, on a windy stretch of sand in North Carolina. In December of 1903, two brothers from Dayton, Ohio, did something that most of the world still considered impossible. They flew the Wright Flyer, a fragile assembly of spruce, muslin, and bicycle chain engineering, lifted off the dunes at Kitty Hawk and stayed in the air for 12 seconds. The flight covered just 120 feet, less than the wingspan of a modern airliner, but it changed everything, and almost no one noticed. For 5 years after Kitty Hawk, the United States government and the great powers of Europe dismissed powered flight as a curiosity, a hobby for eccentrics and daredevils. The Wright brothers offered their invention to the US Army and were rebuffed. European skeptics openly doubted that the Americans had ever really flown at all. Then, in the summer of 1908, Wilbur Wright traveled to France and set up his machine at a racetrack near the town of Le Mans. On the 8th of August, before a crowd of skeptical French aviators and military observers, the elder Wright brother climbed into the pilot's seat of his flyer. The twin propellers spun up behind him, chain-driven by a small four-cylinder engine that produced just 25 horsepower. The machine rolled forward on its wooden skids. It lifted into the air. What Wilbur Wright did next shattered every preconception the Europeans held about powered flight. He banked, he turned. He described perfect figure eights in the sky, controlling the aircraft with a precision that no French or British pioneer had come close to achieving. The flyer stayed aloft for nearly 2 minutes, covering several miles, and when Wright finally descended, the French military observers who had come to scoff were instead taking urgent notes. They understood immediately what they had witnessed: a machine that could remain in the air under perfect control, that could fly where the pilot wished it to go and return safely to its starting point, could see things no cavalry scout could possibly see. The age of aerial reconnaissance had begun, even if no formal doctrine yet existed to guide it. Less than a year later, another flight electrified Europe and terrified Great Britain. In the early morning hours of July 25, 1909, the Frenchman, Louis Blériot, climbed into a tiny monoplane of his own design on a beach near Calais. His Model 11 was little more than a wooden frame covered in fabric, with an engine producing the same 25 horsepower as the Wright Flyer. Blériot had been injured in an earlier crash and walked to his machine on crutches. A stiff breeze was blowing across the English Channel. He had no compass. He took off anyway, pointed his fragile craft towards the white cliffs of Dover, and 36 minutes later landed in a field behind the castle. The English Channel had been crossed by air. Britain was an island no more. The British public reacted to Blériot's flight with a mixture of wonder and deep, primal fear. The prospect of a lone Frenchman crossing the Channel in a 25-horsepower wooden contraption raised a terrifying question. What could a hostile power do with a fleet of larger, faster machines? The press filled with anxious speculation. Maps appeared in newspapers showing the distances from German airship bases to British naval installations and cities. The language of the debate shifted rapidly from curiosity about aviation's possibilities to demands for defense against its threats. Winston Churchill, then serving as First Lord of the Admiralty, captured the new reality in blunt terms. Passive defense against aerial attack, he told Parliament, was hopeless and endless. The only real security was to be master of your own air. But when Churchill backed up his words with money, the allocation told a different story than the public rhetoric suggested. The Royal Navy's aviation budget more than tripled in a single year, a staggering increase driven by anxiety over German airship capabilities. But the line items told the real story. The overwhelming bulk of that funding went to aircraft for scouting, for reconnaissance. The heavy seaplanes Churchill described to Parliament would carry wireless telegraphy that enabled them to signal far over the horizon. They would bring information back to the fleet about enemy movements. Yes, they would also carry explosives to drop on transports, but that was secondary. The primary mission was eyes in the sky. The tension between the public's fear of bombing and the military's need for reconnaissance defined British air policy in those last years before the war. Germany, with its fleet of Count von Zeppelin's giant airships, seemed to hold the advantage in any aerial bombing campaign. British and French manufacturers simply could not build engines powerful enough to lift heavy bomb loads in fixed-wing aircraft. So the Allies concentrated on what their fragile machines could do: observe, photograph, and report. When the German army marched into Belgium in August 1914, executing the Great Wheeling Movement of the Schlieffen Plan, both sides went to war with only a handful of aircraft. The British Expeditionary Force crossed the Channel with 4 squadrons of the Royal Flying Corps, about 60 machines in all. No one yet understood how to use them in combat. They learned fast. By the first week of September, the German advance had pushed deep into France, and the French and British armies fell back towards the Marne River, east of Paris. On September 6th, the opening day of what would become known as the First Battle of the Marne, German reconnaissance aircraft of the First Army took to the air and began cooperating directly with field artillery batteries on the ground. The pilots and observers spotted French troop concentrations, reported their positions, and the German guns opened fire with coordinates provided from the sky. It was rudimentary. It was improvised. There was no established procedure, no standard code, no reliable wireless link. The observers scribbled notes, stuffed them into weighted message bags, and dropped them over the battery positions. The batteries read the notes, calculated the range as best they could, and fired. The delays were maddening, but it worked well enough to matter. The British and French scrambled to match what the Germans were doing. The Royal Flying Corps squadrons threw their pilots and observers into the fight, flying primitive BE-2s and Farmans and Blériots, machines never designed for military operations. The observers leaned out of open cockpits, buffeted by the wind, trying to identify troop movements on the ground below, while also keeping an eye out for enemy aircraft. When they spotted something, they had no direct way to communicate with the artillery. They had to fly away from the observation point, return to a command post or battery location, and drop their reports. By the time the guns received the information, the target might have moved. The precious minutes lost between observation and action frustrated commanders on both sides. They knew the airplane could give them the view they desperately needed. They just had no efficient way to turn that view into fire. The communications gap led to a flurry of improvisation. Crews began experimenting with signal lamps, flashing coded messages to batteries that watched for them from the ground. Others tried smoke signals, firing small pyrotechnic charges from the cockpit to mark a target's location, while the battery commander used a clinometer or sextant to compute the range. British artillery units began laying out cloth panels in prearranged patterns on the ground, signals the aircraft could read and respond to. A captured German document, circulated through the Royal Flying Corps intelligence summaries, revealed that the German army had already developed a sophisticated grid map system with numbered targets and standardized Morse code signals for right, left, long, and short. The Allies took note. They began to build their own systems. But it was slow, painful work, and the delays in ranging and communication that emerged in those early months would haunt the first 2 years of trench warfare. By October of 1914, the war of movement had exhausted itself. The German advance halted. The Allies counterattacked. Neither side could break through. The armies dug in, first shallow rifle pits, then deeper trenches, then elaborate networks of communication trenches, machine gun emplacements, and barbed wire entanglements that stretched from the Swiss border to the North Sea. The stationary war that followed placed a premium on artillery, and artillery placed a premium on observation. Cavalry could no longer scout the enemy's positions. Horses could not cross no man's land. Ground-based observers on high points could see only what the terrain allowed. The airplane and the balloon became, by necessity, the primary eyes of both armies. Aviators who had gone to war expecting individual glory in aerial combat found themselves instead performing the tedious, dangerous, and absolutely essential work of watching. The French, who had dismantled their balloon program years earlier, rushed to reconstitute it. Within months, a dozen French balloon companies were in the field, each with 3 tethered observation platforms. The Germans had entered the war with 23 balloon sections already operational. The British, who had abandoned balloons entirely in favor of heavier-than-air machines, begged the Royal Navy to loan them a kite balloon section. It arrived in May of 1915, equipped with a telephone line running through the tether cable, a simple innovation that allowed the observer to speak directly to the battery commander. The impact was immediate and profound. Balloons could stay aloft for hours, their observers maintaining a steady, unbroken watch over the enemy lines. Airplanes could range deeper, photographing rear areas and spotting targets invisible to the balloon. The 2 platforms complemented each other. Together, they made the artillery a surgeon's scalpel rather than a blunt instrument. Before the war, aviation had been a curiosity, a sport for wealthy daredevils and a speculative technology that military traditionalists largely dismissed. After the Marne, after the trenches dug in, and the guns began their years-long duel, commanders on both sides recognized a fundamental truth. The airplane's primary military value was not as a bomber, not as a fighter, but as a reconnaissance platform that could make artillery deadly. The observation crews, the photographers, the balloon observers, these were the men who gave the great guns their eyes. Their work was unglamorous. It attracted none of the public adulation that would soon envelop the fighter aces, but it was the foundation on which everything else rested. All aviation was built around observation, and the great struggle to perfect that observation, to close the gap between seeing and shooting, would define the next 4 years of the air war. The winter of 1915 along the Western Front was a frozen stalemate. The trench lines had hardened into crusts of ice and mud from the Swiss border to the North Sea, and the artillery on both sides fired blind, hurling shells at map coordinates days or weeks old. Cavalry patrols could no longer penetrate even the outer layers of barbed wire, and the infantry who tried paid with their lives for scraps of intelligence that were obsolete by the time a runner stumbled back to headquarters. The armies that had gone to war in the summer of 1914 were learning the hard way that the old methods of seeing the enemy were dead. They needed eyes that could pass over the wire, over the mud, and look straight down into the enemy's rear areas. The Royal Flying Corps had been providing those eyes since the Marne, but the link between the observer in the air and the gunner on the ground remained primitive, a chain of message bags and signal lamps and hopeful guesses. The photographs that pilots and observers took on their reconnaissance patrols were beginning to accumulate at wing headquarters, but they were not yet being used systematically. That changed in the planning for an attack the British intended to launch near the village of Neuve-Chapelle. General Sir Douglas Haig's First Army was going to punch a hole through the German line, and for the first time the entire artillery plan would be built on what the cameras saw. On the March 1915, the barrage began. The British had assembled the strongest concentration of guns per yard of front ever seen in modern war to that point, an intensity of firepower that would not be equaled again until the mud of Passchendaele 2 years later. Every battery that opened fire that morning had been given a target, plotted not from a cavalry scout sketch, but from an aerial photograph printed on a map that had been updated days, sometimes hours, before the shells left the tubes. The photos revealed the exact course of the German support trenches, the location of machine gun emplacements, and the delicate spiderwebs of barbed wire that would have to be cut before the infantry could advance. The Royal Engineers had worked through the night before the attack, printing thousands of copies of the new photo-derived maps and distributing them down to the battalion level. When the guns fell silent and the infantry went over the top, they advanced with confidence that the wire was broken and the enemy front line pulverized. The initial assault carried the British forward more than a mile in some sectors, a stunning success by the grinding standards of trench warfare. German prisoners taken in the first hours spoke of the bombardment as something new, something terrifyingly precise. If The British had been able to look inside their dugouts before the first shell landed. The breakthrough at Neuve-Chapelle could not be sustained. Communications broke down, as they always did, once the attacking troops moved beyond their own telephone lines. And the German reserves who had been photographed assembling miles behind the front arrived to seal the breach. But the lesson was inescapable. Aerial photography multiplied the accuracy of the artillery, and accurate artillery was the only way to break into a modern trench system. Before the month was out, Haig's headquarters issued a general order requiring that aerial photographs be the basis for all future trench maps, and that every command conference include the latest photomosaics as standard reference material. The Royal Flying Corps absorbed the lesson at the tactical level too. Captured German documents had already revealed an efficient system for air-to-battery communication, a grid map overlaid with numbered squares, and a standard Morse code procedure for signaling corrections left, right, long, or short. British observers had been experimenting with their own methods, firing smoke signals from very pistols and dropping weighted message bags onto command posts. But the German system pointed the way towards something far more sophisticated. Within weeks, every corps squadron on the British front began practicing a standardized set of wireless signals, and the first outline of a true air-artillery partnership began to take shape on the blackboards of wing headquarters. The finest wireless set in the world could not compensate for the inherent instability of the early observation platforms. Airplanes bounced and juddered through the sky, their engines shaking the airframes until the observer's view through his binoculars was a nauseating blur. And even the most stable two-seater could not hold a target in sight for more than a few seconds in any kind of wind. The spherical balloons that had served armies since the American Civil War were worse, spinning and bucking in the breeze until the men in the baskets were too airsick to hold a pencil. What the artillery needed was a platform that could stay fixed over a single point for hours, and the answer was already taking shape in the form of an elongated gas bag with a stabilizing lobe sewn onto its tail, what the Germans called the Drachen. The French and British had entered the war without any kite balloons at all, having dismantled their lighter-than-air programs in the years before 1914, when the airplane seemed to make everything else obsolete. The German army, by contrast, had gone to war with 23 balloon sections ready for service, each with 2 Drachens and the horse-drawn winches needed to tow them forward with the advancing infantry. The Germans had learned during the opening campaigns that a tethered balloon gave an observer a stable, elevated platform from which he could watch for hours at a stretch, and that the same observer could talk directly to his battery by telephone. Thin copper wire threaded through the center of the tether cable. No message bags, no signal lamps, just a voice speaking corrections into a handset. The British got their first kite balloon the hard way, by begging one from the Royal Navy. The Navy had been experimenting with kite balloons for coastal patrol and had taken delivery of several French-manufactured Drachens when the Admiralty received a desperate request from Sir John French, the commander of the British Expeditionary Force. French wanted a balloon to observe for his heavy artillery, and the Navy, against the instincts of its own officers, agreed to loan him a section. The unit, designated No. 1 Kite Balloon Section, arrived at Boulogne on the 8th of May 1915 under the command of a naval major, and by the 25th it was in action near Poperinghe, tethered a few miles behind the British front line. The effect was immediate and dramatic. For the first time, a British heavy battery commander could talk directly to an observer who was looking straight down onto the German rear areas, and the results began to accumulate within hours. The balloon observer could watch a target all day if necessary, calling corrections as each ranging round fell, adjusting the fire until the shells were landing directly on the enemy battery or ammunition dump. He could spot the flash of a German gun the instant it fired and direct counter-battery fire before the smoke cleared. The telephone wire through the tether cable eliminated the half-hour delays of the message bag system, and the stability of the Drachen envelope meant the observer could stay aloft in moderate winds without vomiting over the side of his basket. The artist and the engineer now began to refine the brute tool into something elegant. The German Parseval-Siegsfeld Drachen had a low ceiling, around 1,500 feet in an average wind, and in anything stronger than a stiff breeze, the lobe that was supposed to stabilize the envelope proved insufficient. Observers still got airsick as their baskets pitched and yawed unpredictably, and the photographs they took, when they took them, were often too blurred to be useful. The man who solved the stability problem was a French aeronautical engineer working in the autumn of 1915, and his name was Albert Cacotte. Cacotte looked at the Drachen's single stabilizing lobe and added 2 fins to the sides of the envelope, giving the tail section the appearance of an arrow's fletching. The addition was simple, but the aerodynamic effect was transformative. The cocotte balloon rode the wind instead of fighting it. Even in gusts that had sent Draken observers scrambling for their parachute harnesses, the cocotte stayed nearly level, its 3 fins acting like a weather vane to keep the envelope pointed into the breeze. The stability meant that observers could stay up longer, that their photographs were sharper, and that the telephone link between the basket and the battery remained uninterrupted through an entire firing program. By the early months of 1916, the Cocotte Type R was becoming the standard observation balloon for the French army, and the British were placing urgent orders for their own production batch. The Germans, for their part, managed to capture an intact British Cocotte in the spring of that year, and the commander of the Luftstreitkräfte, General Ernst von Höppner, would later admit that every German balloon put into service after 1916 was a direct copy of the French design. On the 9th of January 1916, No. 2 Kite Balloon Section of the Royal Flying Corps, now equipped entirely with the new Cocotte balloons and the telephone tether system, demonstrated just how far the science of aerial observation had advanced in the 10 months since Neuve-Chapelle. Working in direct communication with the Second Army's Heavy Artillery Group, the section's observers registered 15 separate targets in a single day, rate of fire direction that would have been unthinkable during the chaotic improvisations of 1914. The observers directed shellfire onto German battery positions, ammunition dumps, and troop assembly areas, and they did it without once having to rely on a signal lamp, a message bag, or a hopeful guess. The voice of the observer spoke directly into the ear of the gun commander, and the guns answered. The artillery generals noticed, as the balloon sections multiplied and their efficiency grew. Senior officers like Major General James Birch, the artillery advisor at General Headquarters, began to argue that the balloons should belong to the artillery, not to the Royal Flying Corps. The logic was simple: the balloons did nothing but observe for the guns, and the observers themselves were increasingly being drawn from artillery regiments, men who understood the technical details of ranging, fuse setting, and shell ballistics in a way that career aviators often did not. Birch proposed a gradual takeover, starting with the assignment of a single artillery officer to each balloon section as an observer, a first step toward what he hoped would be a complete transfer of command authority. The commander of the Royal Flying Corps in France, General Hugh Trenchard, watched this bureaucratic maneuver with a cold eye. Trenchard was not opposed to cooperation with the artillery, quite the opposite. He had been the one who ordered wireless telegraphy officers attached to every wing headquarters after studying the captured German procedures the previous June. But he understood that ceding control of the balloons would set a precedent. The Corps observation squadrons, the artillery spotters, and the reconnaissance flyers all performed missions that directly supported the guns. And if the artillery took the balloons, they would soon want the airplanes too. The battle for control of aerial observation was not just about balloons. It was about whether aviation would remain an independent arm or become a subsidiary of the gunners. Trenchard had already made his move in the wireless war. On June 19, 1915, after studying the captured German document that outlined their grid map and Morse code procedure, he had issued an order that every wing headquarters on the British front would have a qualified wireless telegraphy officer assigned to it permanently. The order was a direct response to the realization that the ad hoc methods of the first year, the message bags, the smoke signals, the frantic waving of signal panels, were no longer adequate for the scale of the artillery war that was developing. By the summer of 1916, the Royal Flying Corps was running a wireless school at Brooklands that graduated 20 new observers a month, every one of them trained in the precise protocols of air-to-battery communication. The technical problem that nearly derailed the entire wireless program was interference. As more and more aircraft took to the air with transmitters strapped into their cockpits, the radio spectrum over the Western Front began to fill with overlapping Morse signals, and a battery commander trying to listen for his own observer's call sign found his headphones full of static and crosstalk from the neighboring corps. The solution came from the engineers, a device called the clapper brake, which varied the pitch of each transmitter's signal enough to distinguish one from another on the receiving end. The clapper brake allowed multiple aircraft to operate simultaneously on the same strip of front without drowning each other out, and it opened the door to a dramatic increase in the density of wireless coverage. The second half of the solution was organizational. The Royal Flying Corps and the French Aviation Militaire, both now acutely aware that their observers were stepping on each other's transmissions, worked out a coordinated schedule of firing operations so that artillery shoots in adjacent sectors did not overlap and jam the airwaves. The planners factored in the flight time of an average shell, estimated at 56 seconds, and staggered the calls for fire, so that each observer had a clear window to transmit his corrections. The scheduling was a triumph of staff work, a bureaucratic innovation that amplified the effectiveness of the clapper brake and turned the radio spectrum from a chaotic free-for-all into a managed resource. The culmination of all this technical and organizational work was the zone call system. By the middle of 1916, every corps squadron on the British front was working from a standardized map overlaid with lettered squares, each square subdivided into numbered zones 3,000 yards across. When an observer spotted a fleeting target, a column of troops, a battery limbering up, a motor transport caught in the open, he could transmit two letters, the first identifying his map square and the second the specific zone within it, and any battery within range that heard the call could respond with fire within minutes. The system was fast, flexible, and devastatingly effective. A German infantry battalion caught moving by daylight in a zone call square would find shrapnel bursting over its heads before its officers could even shout the order to scatter. The Germans had been refining their own version of the same system since the first months of the war, and by 1916, they had integrated aerial observation so deeply into their artillery procedures that Paul von Hindenburg, one of the two men now commanding all German armies on the Western Front, could state flatly that engaging the enemy's artillery with the help of aeroplane observers was the principal and most effective means of fighting a defensive battle to a successful conclusion. The German procedure was methodical, almost bureaucratic. The air and artillery crews fixed and numbered their targets in advance, using information culled from aerial reconnaissance photographs, and once aloft, the pilot and observer signaled their readiness and the number of the first target using a standardized list of Morse abbreviations. The science of observation had become a set of forms and checklists. The next innovation came from the operational level, not the technical. By the spring of 1916, the war of movement that had seemed dead and buried in the autumn of 1914 was being asked to stir again, as both sides planned massive offensives that they hoped would break the trench stalemate once and for all. The British were assembling their forces for an attack along the Somme River, a battle that would become synonymous with industrial slaughter, and the artillery plan for the Somme was the most ambitious ever devised. The British would fire more than 1.5 million shells in the week-long preliminary bombardment, and every single gun battery would rely on aerial observation to correct its fire. The demand for wireless-equipped aircraft was about to explode. The Royal Flying Corps responded by doubling the number of wireless aircraft assigned to each mile of front, pushing the density to one transmitter-equipped machine for every 2,000 yards of trench line. The increased coverage meant that more batteries could fire simultaneously, that more targets could be engaged, and that the time between an observer's correction and the next ranging round could be cut from minutes to seconds. The feedback loop between the eye in the sky and the gun on the ground had been tightened to the point where a skilled crew could range a battery onto a target and silence it before the German gunners could hitch up their horses and move. The artillery was no longer firing blind. It was operating with a sight picture as clear as any rifleman's. The cacote balloon and the clapper brake and the zone call system had not yet been tested in the furnace of a major offensive, and the men who were about to test them knew that the Somme would be the proving ground. The British and French armies were massing divisions, stockpiling shells, and printing thousands of photo-derived trench maps in preparation for the great attack. The German defenders, for their part, were digging deeper, reinforcing their dugouts, and preparing their own aerial observation network to direct counter-battery fire against the British guns. What had begun as a handful of officers with signal lamps and weighted bags had become an industrial-scale system of real-time fire direction, and the battle that loomed would determine whether it was enough to break the deadlock. The stage was set for the bloodiest day the British Army had ever suffered, and the quiet work of the observers would be the thread that held the attack together when everything else broke down. The generals in their chateau headquarters would wait by their wireless sets, listening for the Morse signals that told them where their infantry had reached and where the German guns were firing. And in the chaos of the assault, those signals would be the only link between command and the front line. But the story of that day belongs to the contact patrols and the infantry flyers, to the men who flew low over the bayonets and the shell holes, and that story has yet to be told. At 7:30 on a July morning, the British barrage lifted, and 80,000 men climbed out of their trenches along a 14-mile front. The week-long bombardment had flung 1.5 million shells at the German wire and dugouts, every battery ranged by aerial observation. Staff officers at Corps headquarters hunched over map tables covered with photo mosaics, waiting for the first contact reports to come crackling through the wireless sets. The contact patrols went in low two-seater BE-2Cs and FE-2Bs, flying parallel to the advancing waves of infantry. Observers fired signal flares, klaxon horns blared their distinctive note across the smoke-choked battlefield, and the crews watched for the white cloth panels that were supposed to mark the forward line. The panels rarely appeared. Soldiers under machine gun fire and shrapnel had no time, no training, and in many cases no panels at all. The observers did the only thing left to them. They descended below 400 meters, skimming the trench tops so they could distinguish khaki from field grey by eye. German machine gunners tracked the slow, straight-flying aeroplanes and opened fire from every parapet. Machines staggered back to their aerodromes with wings ripped open and elevators shot through, and several did not return at all. The same pattern repeated across every division that advanced that morning. Flares ignored, panels hidden, and contact patrols reduced to flying suicidal low passes to read uniforms. The lesson was written in burning wreckage. Before the Somme battle ended, orders went out for every senior infantry school in France to add aircraft liaison training to its syllabus, and the first tentative steps were taken toward the infantry contact schools of 1917. By mid-September, the Somme offensive had ground forward a few thousand yards at enormous cost, and a fresh push targeted the village of Courcelette. Canadian troops went in behind a creeping barrage on the 15th, and this time something changed. As the Canadians consolidated their hold on the shattered ruins, they lit a semicircle of red flares around the village perimeter. High overhead, reconnaissance machines from the Corps squadrons ran their photographic runs, their big 24-inch lens cameras bolted over a hole cut in the observer's cockpit floor. The camera was a brute, heavy and unwieldy, requiring the observer to manhandle glass plates in an open cockpit, while a handheld wind stabilizer fought the slipstream. Each exposure captured a strip of ground with such precision that cartographers could count individual shell holes. The man driving much of this technical work was an aerial photography pioneer named John Moore Brabazon, who had been experimenting with emulsions and camera mounts since before the war. Moore Brabazon and his team had developed stereoscopic plotting techniques that turned overlapping photographs into three-dimensional models of the terrain. A gun pit, a machine gun nest, a sniper's hide. None of them could disappear into the mud when viewed through a stereoscope. That night, the photographic sections worked under canvas and in commandeered farmhouses, developing plates and printing contact strips. Cartographers traced the new trench lines onto the 1 to 10,000 scale maps, updating every fire trench, every communication sap, every new shell hole that could serve as cover for a counterattack. At dawn, the gunners had fresh maps on their plotting tables, and the barrage shifted forward with an accuracy that would have been impossible a year before. The camera never tired, never misread a map, and never flinched under shell fire. The exhausted infantryman, by contrast, had learned to ignore the aeroplane overhead, to keep his head down and his panel folded in his pack. The Somme had proven that the photograph could see what the soldier would not show, and the staff planners began to build their future offensives around the lens instead of the flare. The sea was a killing field in the spring of 1917. In April alone, German U-boats sent nearly 900,000 tons of Allied shipping to the bottom, and Britain's food reserves dipped below 6 weeks' supply. The Admiralty had tried dispersing merchant vessels across the ocean, but the submarines simply hunted them down one by one. The only method that showed any promise was the convoy system, a tight formation of cargo steamers surrounded by destroyers and armed trawlers. But a convoy was only as safe as its eyes were sharp, and the escorts could not see beneath the waves where the submarines lay in wait, nor far enough across the grey Atlantic to spot a periscope before it was too late. The Admiralty needed a way to push its vision outward, to scan the sea lanes from above, and the answer was already flying over the trenches of France. The 6th of April delivered a seismic shift in the balance of power. The United States declared war on Germany, and within weeks Vice Admiral William Sims, stationed in London as the senior American naval representative, sent a cable to the Navy Department that landed like a bombshell. The British required 100 kite balloon sections for convoy escort duty, and they needed them immediately. Each section would tether an observation balloon to a merchant ship or an escort vessel, lifting a pair of eyes a few thousand feet above the sea, where a trained observer could scan for the telltale feather of a periscope wake. The American industrial machine, however, was barely idling when it came to lighter-than-air production. In April 1917, American looms could turn out enough rubberized cloth to manufacture no more than 2 balloons per week. The crash program that followed would have to compress years of industrial development into months. The man responsible for making that program work was Charles Chandler, commandant of the Army Balloon School at Fort Omaha, Nebraska. Chandler had reopened the school just 5 months earlier, in November 1916, after a 3-year closure that had reduced American lighter-than-air capability to a single obsolete balloon left over from the chase after Pancho Villa. Now the War Department expected him not only to train hundreds of observers and winch operators, but also to coordinate a manufacturing effort that would blanket the Atlantic with observation platforms. Chandler understood the physics of the problem. A convoy escort balloon needed to ride steady in a 30-knot Atlantic gale. Its observer must maintain voice communication with the escort commander, and the envelope itself had to be the stable Cocotte type, with 3 stabilizing fins that the French and British had perfected over 2 years of trench warfare. Teaching American industry to stitch those envelopes was a challenge of an entirely different magnitude. The factories answered the call. Goodyear and Goodrich converted tire assembly lines to coat fabric with rubber sealant, while Connecticut Aircraft and Nabenschuh Manufacturing fabricated envelopes at an unthinkable pace. Firestone joined the consortium, and United States Rubber fed a supply chain that stretched from Ohio to the Atlantic coast. By autumn, the assembly sheds were delivering enough Cocotte envelopes to equip a new balloon company every week, still short of the 100 sections the Navy demanded, but enough to begin turning the tide. That summer, Chandler's school at Fort Omaha sent its first trained observers to the fleet, men who had learned to distinguish a periscope wake from a whitecap, to call depth charge corrections in a pitching basket, and to keep their nerve when the balloon bucked in a rising sea. The American balloon program was the answer to a crisis that had been building since 1915, when the Germans first unleashed their submarines against merchant shipping without warning. But the convoy escort mission was not the only place where aerial observation was reshaping the war at sea. Along the Belgian coast, the Royal Navy's monitors squatted in the shallows, flat-bottomed gunboats mounting battleship-caliber guns, shelling German coastal batteries and submarine pens from ranges of 10 or 12 miles. Those guns were firing at targets they could not see, hidden behind dunes and sea walls, and for 2 years the Navy had struggled with a grid-based spotting system that required preparing a unique map for every target. The system was slow, imprecise, and nearly useless against fleeting targets like a U-boat recharging its batteries on the surface. The gunners needed something faster, something the Army had already figured out 2 years earlier in the mud of Neuve-Chapelle. The autumn of 1917 brought the men who would solve that problem together in a committee room at the Admiralty. The Royal Navy's Monitor Spotting Committee convened in December 1917 with a single mandate: standardize the way seaplane observers ranged the big guns. The members studied after-action reports from the Dover Patrol, the force of monitors and destroyers that fought a grinding, daily artillery duel with German heavy batteries along the Flanders coast. They read the Royal Flying Corps manuals that had been refined on the Somme, the same manuals that described a celluloid clock code disc marked with concentric circles at 50-yard intervals, and the numerals 12 through 11 representing the compass points. The system required the observer to calculate only one distance instead of 2. It worked on any target without advanced preparation, and the Morse signals were short enough to transmit in seconds, even with the primitive wireless sets carried by seaplanes. The committee recommended adoption of the Army's clock code, and the new procedures were communicated to the Vice Admiral commanding the Dover Patrol in a letter dated February 21, 1918. A seaplane took off from a tender in the Grey Waters, off the Belgian coast on the 9th of November. The aircraft was a short 184 floatplane, its single-pusher engine drumming through the mist, its observer strapped into the front cockpit with a map case, a wireless key, and a map overprinted with the grid squares that the Royal Navy had used for spotting since 1915. He was working with a monitor lying a mile offshore, one of the flat-bottomed gunboats that had been pounding the German coastal batteries since dawn. As the big shells arced over the dunes, the observer watched the bursts bloom against the sand, called the correction into his handset, short, right, 200 yards, and saw the next salvo walk directly onto the target. That exchange was logged in the war diary of HMS Raglan, a monitor that would later be lost to a U-boat attack, and it marked the moment when the precision observation techniques forged in the furnace of the Western Front arrived at sea. The clock code was not simply a technical upgrade. It was the final link in a causal chain that connected the submarine menace to the survival of convoys. A U-boat caught on the surface was a fragile thing, its pressure hull vulnerable to even a light shell from a deck gun, but it could submerge in less than 30 seconds. A surface escort spotting a periscope at 3,000 yards might not close the distance before the submarine disappeared. A seaplane circling above the convoy at 2,000 feet could see that same periscope at 5 miles, could call a monitor or a destroyer onto the target, with a clock code signal transmitted in under 10 seconds, and could watch the splashes walk across the U-boat's diving position before the submarine's ballast tanks even filled. The British had been hunting submarines with aircraft since 1915, but the success rate had been dismal because the seaplane observer could not communicate his observations fast enough or precisely enough. The clock code changed that equation entirely. The practical results accumulated through the autumn and winter of 1917. Seaplane patrols from the Royal Naval Air Service stations at Felixstowe, Great Yarmouth, and Dunkirk began flying continuous daylight patrols over the North Sea and the Channel approaches, each machine carrying a small bomb load alongside its wireless set. The patrol doctrine was simple: find a U-boat on the surface, call in a surface escort if one was within range, and attack with bombs only if the submarine began to dive and the chance of capture was lost. The aircraft were fragile things, short 184s and Felixstowe F-2A flying boats with wooden hulls and fabric-covered wings that could stay aloft for 6 hours in good weather, but were grounded by the North Sea gales that swept in every third day. The work was monotonous, hour after hour of staring at grey water broken only by whitecaps, and the observers' logbooks filled with the same laconic entry: nothing sighted. But the monotony was the point. The submarines could not attack what they could not see, and they could not surface to recharge their batteries under the constant eye of the patrols. The Navy had come to the same conclusion the Army had reached in the autumn of 1914. The airplane's primary military value was not as a bomber, but as a pair of elevated eyes. The same technology that allowed an observer in a Cacotte balloon to register 15 targets in a day for a heavy artillery group. The same clock code disc that a Corps squadron observer on the Somme used to call shrapnel onto a German trench in 2 minutes was now being unspooled over the sea lanes. The mission was different, hunting submarines instead of ranging howitzers, but the method was identical. A trained man in a stable observation platform, linked by wireless to the guns he directed, transformed a blind weapon into a precision instrument. The naval aviators were learning what their army counterparts had learned at Neuve-Chapelle and the Somme. Bombing harbors and strafing trenches might make headlines, but the war would be won or lost on the ability to see over the horizon and talk what you saw back to the gunners. The spring offensives of 1918 shattered the trench stalemate that had gripped the Western Front for 3.5 years. On March 21st, German stormtroops surged through the fog along a 50-mile front, driving deep into British lines near the old Somme battlefield. The front began to move, and every army on the Allied side scrambled to adapt its artillery observation methods to a war of rapid advance and retreat. Balloon companies, which had spent years anchored to fixed positions behind static trench systems, now faced the same mobility challenge that had frustrated Napoleon's aeronauts more than a century earlier. American units arriving at the front would inherit this new reality from the moment they entered the line. The 2nd Balloon Company became the first American lighter-than-air unit to reach the fighting. Arriving at Toul in February 1918, its crews trained with French Cacotte balloons, the 3-fin design that had proven stable in winds that made the older Druschen types pitch and yaw violently. The American observers came from a mix of air service officers and artillerymen, a blend the Army had adopted after studying British experience on the Somme. The balloonists set up their winches a few miles behind the front, ran their telephone cables through the steel tethers, and began the daily routine of rising before dawn to be aloft at first light. Within weeks, the company was directing fire onto German batteries and reporting the movement of troops and supplies along roads and rail lines in the enemy rear. The war of movement demanded constant relocation. The 2nd Balloon Company learned to walk its inflated caquots forward behind advancing infantry, a slow and hazardous process that involved dodging shell craters, navigating around shattered tree stumps, and temporarily lifting telephone wires with long poles. When time permitted, crews deflated the envelope and packed it onto trucks for faster transport. But the pace of operations in the spring and summer of 1918 rarely allowed such leisure. The balloonists refined a technique of advancing at night after the day's artillery program had ended, inflating fresh envelopes at the new position, and being ready to observe again by daybreak. It was exhausting work, performed under constant threat from German fighters specifically assigned to hunt observation balloons. The danger was real and persistent. Across the American Balloon Company's 259 days on the Western Front, observers made a combined 116 parachute descents when enemy aircraft or artillery set their balloons ablaze. That rate of attack, nearly one jump every 2 days, reflected the intensity of German anti-balloon efforts during the open warfare phase. The 2nd Balloon Company, which served the longest continuous stretch of any American aerial unit at the front, endured many of these attacks. German pilots, many flying the new Fokker DVII, with its twin Spandau machine guns firing incendiary ammunition, considered balloons high-value targets. A single pass through a balloon line could force a dozen observers to leap from their baskets simultaneously, parachuting into friendly territory, while their hydrogen envelopes collapsed in flames behind them. The Americans learned to keep their hands on the ripcord at all times and to watch the sky as intently as they watched the ground. March and April brought more American balloon companies to the front, as Chandler's training program at Fort Omaha and the school at Camp Souge in France fed graduates into the line by late spring. American factories were turning out Cacotte envelopes at a rate that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. Goodyear and Goodrich alone had converted entire production bays to rubberized fabric manufacturing, producing envelopes faster than the German Air Force could destroy them. The planned expansion called for 139 companies by June 1919, the number that would have saturated the entire Western Front with American observation platforms. In Germany, General von Hoepner's Luftstreitkräfte had lost 135 balloons during 1917, and the attrition showed no signs of slowing. The balloon gap was becoming as strategically significant as the U-boat campaign. What made the balloon so lethal was its telephone link to the batteries. An observer at 5,000 feet could describe a target in plain language, hear the battery commander's acknowledgement, and correct fire in real time, without the Morse code delays that still hampered airplane crews. When a heavy battery was working against a fleeting target, like a German supply column moving through a crossroads village, the observer could track the column's movement and adjust fire as the trucks tried to scatter. One American report estimated that balloons provided 93% of all artillery observation at the front during 1918. The airplane might range deeper behind enemy lines, but the balloon was the constant, tireless eye over the battlefield itself. By late summer, the American Expeditionary Force was ready for its first independent operation. General John Pershing had secured Allied agreement for an American offensive to eliminate the St. Mihiel salient, a German bulge in the line south of Verdun that had existed since 1914. Planning began in August, and the Air Service assembled its largest concentration of force, yet 15 American balloon companies, 6 French balloon sections, and a full complement of pursuit, bomber, and observation squadrons under the overall command of Brigadier General William Mitchell. The photo mosaics prepared for the operation covered every inch of the salient, updated continuously from reconnaissance flights that ran multiple daily sorties. Staff officers pinned the mosaics to tables at the planning conferences, marking artillery targets, infantry objectives, and the routes each balloon company would follow as the attack advanced. The balloons were integrated into the battle plan from the start, not as afterthoughts but as essential components. Each company surveyed its assigned route of advance before the attack, studying maps and aerial photographs to identify potential obstacles. Balloon commanders attended the nightly conferences where Corps artillery officers allocated the next day's targets, and they returned to their units with detailed firing schedules that specified which batteries they would range and at what times. The plan anticipated that telephone lines would break as the infantry advanced, and it designated alternate communication methods. In some sectors, battery commanders planned to station themselves at the base of winch trucks and relay corrections by megaphone if the phone lines failed. The attack opened on September 12, 1918, behind a massive artillery barrage directed largely from the air. The balloons went up at first light, 15 American and 6 French Caquots, rising along the salient's perimeter like a line of watchful grey whales. Adverse weather prevented effective observation during the first 2 days, with rain and low cloud obscuring the ground, but the balloons remained aloft through the poor conditions, maintaining a general surveillance that tracked German troop movements even when precise artillery ranging was impossible. On the 3rd and 4th days, as the weather cleared and the German defenses began to collapse, the balloon observers found their targets with devastating accuracy. The pace of the advance forced the balloon companies into their practice routine of walking inflated caquots forward behind the infantry. The crews had rehearsed this maneuver, and they executed it under shell fire with a discipline that amazed French observers who had spent years watching their own balloonists struggle with the same task. One French officer noted that the American balloon section had moved forward so rapidly during the attack that their headquarters could send warning only by courier cyclists. By nightfall on September 13th, most of the American balloon companies had repositioned and were ready to resume observation at dawn. Only one balloon in the entire St. Mihiel operation was lost to German fighters, a testament to both the effectiveness of American pursuit patrols and the skill of the balloon crews in managing their descents. The St. Mihiel salient collapsed in 4 days. The aerial photo mosaics that Mitchell had used to plan the operation were themselves updated every 6 hours during the battle, with reconnaissance aircraft photographing the new front line and photo sections developing the prints under canvas close behind the guns. Cartographers transferred the fresh imagery onto the plan directeur maps that every battery commander relied upon. The speed of this cycle photograph, develop, print, map, distribute had been compressed from days in 1915 to hours in 1918. The German defenders, their wire cut by the preliminary bombardment, and their artillery blinded by the loss of their own observation balloons, fell back in disarray. The victory at St. Mihiel validated the model that 3 years of bitter fighting had forged: aviation, artillery, and infantry operating as a single integrated weapon. But the rapid advance also exposed the fragility of that model under conditions of open warfare. Telephone wires could not be laid fast enough to keep pace with troops moving forward. The balloon's megaphone relay system was a stopgap, not a solution. The Air Service's training bulletins circulating after the battle urged observers to use zone calls more aggressively and to press battery commanders to accept fleeting target assignments with less preliminary ranging. The need for pre-planned barrage maps derived from aerial photographs was increasing exponentially as the front accelerated. 2 weeks later, the Meuse-Argonne offensive opened on September 26th, a far larger operation that would become the biggest battle in American military history. 13 American balloon companies took part, advancing behind the infantry across terrain that the Germans had fortified in depth for 4 years. The 50th Aero Squadron, flying American-built DH-4 observation machines, received the assignment of maintaining infantry contact for the 77th Division. The squadron's crews understood their job precisely. Their historian would later describe infantry liaison as the reason for having aviation in modern warfare, the mission that could save or destroy thousands of lives of our own troops. But they had already learned at St. Mihiel that American infantrymen rarely displayed the signal panels that were supposed to mark the front line. The problem that had plagued the British on the Somme in 1916 was repeating itself with American troops in 1918. The infantry, under fire and exhausted, ignored the klaxon horns and signal flares that contact patrol aircraft fired to request the location of the line. The 50th Aero Squadron's crews were forced to descend below 400 meters, skimming treetops to distinguish American brown from German field gray by eye. Machine guns opened on them from every direction. Several aircraft were lost in the first days of the offensive, and many more returned to their fields riddled with bullet holes. On September 28th, for the first time, an infantry unit actually displayed its white cloth panels in response to an aircraft signal. The squadron record noted that this lone success did much to further the enthusiasm for this work. It remained the exception. By early October, the 77th Division's advance had penetrated deep into the Argonne forest, but its left flank had stalled. The 1st Battalion of the 308th Infantry Regiment, some 550 men under Major Charles Whittlesey, had pushed forward into a ravine and found itself cut off. German forces closed in on 3 sides, and the terrain, a tangle of thick woods and steep ravines, made visual identification from the air nearly impossible. Whittlesey sent a carrier pigeon back to division headquarters with a message giving the battalion's presumed position. The 50th Aero Squadron received orders to attempt contact. 2 DH-4s took off on October 5th, carrying messages, chocolate, and cigarettes for the trapped men. They returned without having located the unit. The next day, October 6th, they tried again. Lieutenant Harold Goetler flew the lead DH-4 that morning. His observer was Lieutenant Erwin Bleckley, a former artillery officer who had transferred to aviation specifically for this kind of work. They approached the ravine and descended to treetop height, barely 50 feet above the ground, searching for any sign of American uniforms among the dense foliage. German machine guns in the surrounding hills poured fire into the slow-moving two-seater. The aircraft was struck repeatedly. Bleckley, though mortally wounded, continued to mark positions on his map, noting where panels might have been displayed and where the enemy was concentrated. Goetler kept the DH-4 level, giving his observer every possible chance to locate the battalion. At last, riddled beyond control, the machine went down inside friendly lines. Both men were pulled from the wreckage. Goetler was dead. Bleckley died before reaching a dressing station. The sacrifice was not in vain. 2 days later, on October 8th, the lost battalion finally displayed a signal panel. The location was east of the coordinates that Whittlesey's carrier pigeon had reported, which explained why the supply bundles dropped on the previous 3 days had mostly fallen onto German positions. Armed with the true location, American artillery shifted its barrages to clear a corridor, and patrols reached the trapped battalion that evening. Of the 550 men who had entered the ravine, fewer than 200 walked out. The rest were dead, wounded, or captured. Harold Goetler and Erwin Bleckley received posthumous medals of honor, the only awards of the nation's highest decoration for an infantry contact patrol during the entire war. The 50th Aero Squadron continued flying contact patrols until November 6th, its final day of operations. In the war's last weeks, with the German army in retreat across France, the need for infantry liaison eclipsed every other mission. The crews had by then refined their methods to a grim efficiency. They had learned that flying low enough to read uniform colors worked more reliably than any signal system, that the infantry would cooperate when rested and ignore them when under fire, and that every mission flown below 500 feet carried a high probability of loss. The lesson was hard and unambiguous. Aerial observation had become the indispensable link between the artillery, the infantry, and the commanders who directed them. Its quiet, unglamorous work had enabled every advance from the Marne to the Meuse. But even as the guns fell silent, the institutional battle over who would control this new weapon was already beginning. The guns fell silent at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. Within weeks, the vast aerial observation network that had directed 12 million shells onto German targets began to dissolve. Squadrons flew their machines to designated depots. Engines were drained of oil and fuel. Cameras were packed into wooden crates and shipped home or sold for scrap. The balloons that had provided 93% of all artillery observation came down from the sky for the last time. Their hydrogen was vented, their envelopes folded, and their winch trucks parked in muddy fields to await disposal. The institutional battle that General Birch and General Trenchard had fought over control of observation balloons was decided not by doctrine, but by arithmetic. Congress demanded immediate demobilization. The Army's budget collapsed. Every branch fought for what remained. The Air Service, still a junior component of the Signal Corps, had to prove it could win wars on its own to justify any budget at all. Observation could not win wars alone. Observation served the artillery. And the artillery generals, who had tried to seize the balloons in 1916, now had their opening. In the winter months following the armistice, senior Air Service officers gathered in Washington to fight for the future of American military aviation. They faced a brutal choice. They could cling to the observation mission that had proven its worth in France and remain permanently subordinate to the Army's ground commanders. Or they could sacrifice that mission and stake their claim to independence on a new doctrine, one that promised to leapfrog the trenches entirely and carry destruction directly to the enemy's cities. The officers looked at the budget projections and made their calculation. The calculation was cold and pragmatic. Balloons and corps observation squadrons could be surrendered to the artillery. Let the ground gunners have their eyes in the sky. In exchange, the Air Service would retain control of pursuit and bombing units, the branches that could be sold to Congress as war-winning weapons. Reconnaissance, the mission that had consumed the vast majority of wartime sorties, was rebranded as an auxiliary function. It was the price of admission to the fight for independence. The airmen paid it without public debate. Across the Atlantic, the Royal Air Force was engaged in the same brutal arithmetic. Hugh Trenchard, now Chief of the Air Staff, had spent the war fighting to keep observation squadrons under aviation command. In peacetime, he presided over their gutting. The RAF's corps squadrons shrank from 20 at the armistice to a handful within 3 years. The balloon companies vanished entirely. The service that had been built on the principle that aviation's primary duty was to serve as the eyes of the Army now staked its future on the proposition that bombers alone could deter or win. The next war, by 1921, the institutional pivot was complete. General William Mitchell, the hero of St. Mihiel, who had commanded the largest concentration of American air power in the war, emerged as the public face of the campaign for an independent air force. Mitchell's publicity machine bypassed the Army's chain of command entirely, taking his argument directly to the American people through newspaper articles, magazine features, and carefully staged demonstrations. His message was simple and terrifying. The next war would be decided not by armies in trenches, but by fleets of bombers striking deep into the enemy homeland. Mitchell illustrated his argument with dramatic imagery. Posters and newspaper illustrations showed waves of enemy aircraft circling over New York Harbor, while submarines passed the Statue of Liberty into the Hudson River. The message was unmistakable. Only an independent air force built around long-range bombers could protect the American homeland from the fate that had nearly befallen Britain. Nowhere in this campaign did Mitchell mention the 12 million shells that aerial observers had directed onto German targets. Nowhere did he mention the balloons. Nowhere did he mention that the vast majority of wartime sorties had been flown by reconnaissance crews. The erasure of the observer from public memory was not accidental. It was a deliberate act of institutional self-preservation. When an Air Service witness appeared before the House Appropriations Committee that same year, a congressman asked a direct question. What percentage of wartime sorties had been reconnaissance missions? The witness answered, according to the official record, about 93%. Then he added the words that defined the next 2 decades of American aviation policy. But we do not ask for money for that. The historians followed where the budgets led. Walter Raleigh, the official historian of the Royal Air Force, published the first volume of the British Air War history in 1922. Raleigh acknowledged the quiet work of the pilots and observers who flew in direct cooperation with the infantry and noted that this work was apt to be obscured by the more spectacular attention which attaches to air fighting. The sentence was a prophecy. Within a decade, the observation crews who had made artillery lethal, who had photographed every trench on the Western Front, who had walked their balloons forward behind advancing infantry, were footnotes. The interwar histories that shaped public understanding of the Great War in the air were written by men who had flown fighters or who dreamed of fleets of bombers. Their books filled the shelves: Richthofen, Rickenbacker, Guynemer, Ball. The names became legend. The men who had flown 2-seaters over the lines day after day, month after month, photographing trench systems and calling down fire on German batteries, vanished from the story. Their victory was too quiet to remember and too tied to the mud and slaughter of the trenches to celebrate. The air forces that emerged in the 1930s were built not on the lessons of the war that had just been fought, but on the promise of the war to come. That promise would be tested in the skies over London, Dresden, and Tokyo. The bombers would fly, the cities would burn. But when historians eventually re-examined the record, they found that the reconnaissance crews of the First World War had not been an irrelevant prelude to the age of strategic bombing. They had been the essential foundation on which all subsequent air power was built. Charles Chandler, who had rebuilt the American balloon program from nothing, remained in the air service and later championed lighter-than-air development before his retirement. Ernst von Hoepner retired from the army after the armistice, and John Moore Brabazon went on to serve in the House of Lords while remaining an influential voice in British aviation. The cameras that mapped Normandy in 1944, the drones that track movement across modern battlefields, the satellites that peer down from orbit, all trace their lineage back to the men who flew wooden biplanes with glass plate cameras, bolted to the cockpit floor. They put eyes all over the sky, and for a brief moment the armies of the world could see everything. If someone in your family served in a balloon company, a photo reconnaissance squadron, or any of the observation units that made up the vast majority of the First World War's air services, please share their story in the comments below. We would be honored to hear it. Subscribe to the channel and give this video a like to support more documentaries that bring these forgotten histories back into the light. Thank you for watching.